Hello and a very warm welcome, viewers. You're watching the brand new edition of To The Point with your host, Kriti Mishra. India's economy has been hit by the exogenous shock of COVID-19 pandemic, just the way it has disrupted economies worldwide. As the overall numbers suggest, the pandemic might be slowing down. So how will India trigger an economic recovery after the second wave? Let's find out from a very special guest who joins us on the show today. Joining us, Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. KV Subramanian. So, welcome to Rajya Sabha TV and thank you so much for joining us.
Very good evening, Kriti, and very good evening to all the viewers as well.
Good evening, sir. And before we start, I do remember your affinity for cricket. And I also remember early this year, you equated the recovery posted by the Indian economy in the aftermath of the first wave of the pandemic with the Herculean recovery made by the Indian cricket team during the Australian series. We were talking about V-shaped recovery then. And after the second wave, what is your assessment, given the fact that we did not see a nationwide lockdown?
So, cricket parallel again, Kriti, the first couple of months, April and May have been swinging conditions again, like they were last year. The second wave, impacted. So think about it as if where we were batting really well till, the 45th over or so, a couple of overs now, we've had to sort of play carefully. And I think going forward from July onwards, and I think, second half of this month, we should again start, hitting some boundaries on the economy. But let's see in more seriously using data. Let me back this assessment. Firstly, if you look at the second wave of the pandemic itself, the pandemic rose very fast. The peak, was hit very fast. At the same time, the decline has been as sharp as well. And the researchers whom I keep talking to consistently, on relating to the pandemic, are assessing that by the mid of June, the pandemic should have subsided. The trough should have been hit, and therefore a lot of the restrictions that have been, enforced so far can start coming out. Secondly, if you look at the restrictions themselves, they've been asynchronous and especially heterogeneous in terms of their timing. In the month of April, for instance, a few states were having restrictions. May has been far more widespread, and this has impacted some of the high frequency numbers. For instance, if you look at e-way bills and power consumption, it did dip a little bit in April, dipped more in the month of May. But what we are also seeing is over the last 10 days, as the pandemic has started to subside, these numbers are going up. Over the last 10 days, both e-way bills and power consumption is going up. And I think that is something which is, which indicates that the fear of the pandemic seems to be reducing, and therefore some of the economic activity coming back as well. Let me also talk about the overall last year's, the way the economy performed, given that we've just gotten the annual GDP numbers. For me, there are, 3 points that are worth taking into account, from the GDP numbers. Firstly, if you remember, the first quarter has been the one that has really, the first quarter decline of almost 25% is the one that has really impacted the overall annual numbers, and that itself was because of the very intense lockdown that we had to go through for saving lives. Since then, and if you recall, after the first quarter numbers had come, I had mentioned that in the GDP growth numbers, there will be a V-shaped recovery with a much lower negative number for Q2, marginally positive for Q3, and even more positive for Q4. We are glad that that is indeed how the GDP numbers have transpired, especially Q3 and Q4. We must be looking at the GVA growth, which if you look at 1.6% for Q3 and 3.7% for Q4, clearly suggests actually the V as well. And I was seeing in a lot of newspapers the plots of this which were looking V as well. Third aspect, which is important to keep in mind here, is if you unpack these numbers, especially for the fourth quarter, there are some very key points that come out. One, if you look at the ratio of gross fixed capital formation to GDP, which basically captures the investment in the economy, which is quite critical for sustained growth. At 34%, it was a high in 26 quarters. And I think that is a very important point. If you put that together with the increase in construction, the construction sector grew at close to 15% in the fourth quarter. And the emphasis on infrastructure, as was seen in construction activity, then also meant that consumption, after having declined for 3 quarters, showed positive growth of 2.7% in the fourth quarter. And many of the contact-sensitive sectors as well, travel, tourism, etc. When you look at that, after having declined at high rates in 3 quarters, declined at only 2.3%. So when you put this together, the fact that the emphasis on capital expenditure, especially infrastructure spending through construction, has had its positive impact spill over on consumption and on other sectors as well. I think so these three aspects must be kept in mind as well when we look at the overall. So in other words, the overall decline is because of the pandemic, but there has been a very good recovery, in the top line numbers of GDP growth. And if you look at to unpack, then you see this philosophy of capital expenditure, infrastructure-driven growth, the positive spillovers of that actually manifesting as well.
All right, Dr. Subramanian, but talking about the recovery ahead, in RBI monetary policy, the MPC kept status quo today. There's a growing clamour for fiscal measures. During the first wave, we saw the special economic and comprehensive package of 20 lakh crore. Do we expect a fresh, tailor-made stimulus package needed to fight the second COVID wave?
So, Kriti, here we have to remember that the 20 lakh crore package had to be brought in firstly, because the budget was presented at a time when the pandemic was not there. The 1st February 2020 budget was a non-pandemic budget. And as the pandemic, had its impact, and the first wave had a significant impact because of the lockdown, the huge uncertainty that was there at that time, there was definitely a huge need, and therefore the steps were brought out. In contrast, if you look at this year's budget, the 1st February 2021, that was a budget that was amidst the pandemic, and actually a budget that was created keeping in mind the recovery, enabling the recovery. And therefore, if you notice, the fiscal expansion was significant. 9.5% fiscal deficit for the year that went by, and 6.5% fiscal deficit for this particular year. That's a significant fiscal expansion. At the same time, if you also remember the emphasis on capital expenditure, the emphasis on reforms, all of that have been brought in because the supply side is equally important to focus on apart from the demand side. Otherwise, as I mentioned before, if you only focus on the demand side, you will have the problem of runaway inflation as you had after the global financial crisis, something that we certainly, cannot. So unlike the last year where the budget was, not presented with a pandemic in mind, this year's budget was presented keeping in mind the pandemic, and across the board there was widespread support for the philosophy that underlied this year's budget. In terms of the fiscal expansion, the counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and the expansion focused on capital expenditure, the reforms, the banking sector reforms, privatization of public sector banks, insurance company, LIC's listing, all those got widespread support. So now remember that budget, is for 12 months, of which only 2 months have transpired so far. And those 2 months also have been ones where in the month of May, there have been significant restrictions. So many of the expenditure, much of the expenditure that is planned in the budget will start happening now as the restrictions come off. And as we discussed earlier, the spending, impact of that spending, the positive spillovers that happened in the fourth quarter, there is no reason why the same thing should not repeat again, because construction sector, remember, actually is one of the most important for creating jobs in the informal sector, especially for the urban poor, and which is something that is quite important. We also saw in the fourth quarter that the emphasis on construction infrastructure spending also helped, sectors like travel, tourism, etc., compared to previous quarters. That is something which is quite important. The other important aspect is that there is a significant emphasis now on vaccination, with the government focusing on supply. And given the supply projections that NEGVAC has made, my own assessment, and my office has done this assessment, I foresee with some effort, and ambition, we can reach 70 crore people getting one dose before Navratri. That is by the end of September. And if you look at a lot of the research, there's a recent article, preprint article in Lancet, which shows that even one dose of the vaccine, is making a huge impact on reducing the intensity of COVID, of the infection, 80% reduction in the likelihood of deaths. And so if you're able to cover 70 crore people by September, which is before Navratri, there should be a significant impact on, on a lot of the contact sensitive sectors and demand in other sectors as well. The other point that I would mention again, in the fourth quarter numbers, if you notice, manufacturing grew significantly. Industry grew at almost 8%, and that has been a consistent pattern since September of last year.
All right, sir, you're saying that the government is ready for the additional steps, but some sectors have been hit particularly hard, like tourism, hospitality. They need special attention.
Kriti, as I was saying earlier as well, these sectors, will improve. The demand in this will improve significantly as economic activity starts picking up, and especially as vaccination starts rolling out significantly. If you notice, and we paid a cost for this, but if you notice that by March, a lot of the fear of the pandemic had reduced significantly, and that is why a lot of the that eventually it is the dissipation of the fear of the pandemic that is quite critical for demand in these sectors to come back, and therefore vaccination becomes really critical. And as I was mentioning, I do see, with ambition and with effort, we can, target 70 crore doses of, first dose by September. For instance, if you look at after 1st of March, when the vaccination program was open to the general public, we have done 42 lakh doses a day, at its peak. Now, this was with just one shift of 9 hours a day. If you're able to do 2 shifts, we can easily double this. And if you are able to vaccinate 24/7 for a couple of months, not for the entire year, but for a couple of months, if you're doing 24/7, and I think especially in the month of August and September, because that's when the supplies are expected to be very high. If you can do that, then we can easily do 1 crore a day. And 1 crore a day for 2 months, basically we can do 60 crore doses. And if I just checked our numbers, as of 31st of May, we had vaccinated, 4.5 crore people had received 2 doses, and about 17 crore, 16.8 crore to be precise, had received 1 dose, which means that we basically have to do another 50 crore people, which we can definitely do. And as I was saying earlier as well, that even 1 dose seems to make a significant difference in reducing the impact of the pandemic. It will also help in reducing the impact of a potential third wave, because my conversation with a lot of the experts, especially doctors, tells me that if you get even one dose, then the intensity of the infection is much lower. So I actually would like to really emphasize, and that's something the government is already doing. You would have noticed in the last couple of days, not only has there been movement on the United States, facilitating raw materials for the vaccines being manufactured domestically, but also vaccines being shared, Pfizer vaccine. There's also a conversation with Johnson and Johnson, which is a one-dose vaccine, by the way, and therefore actually really enables, for a large population like ours. And also e-biotech, about 300 million, 30 crore vaccines. So all these will really enable on the supply side. And they are the ones that are really critical for us to get back demand on these contact sensitive sectors, as we saw with the fourth quarter as well. If you recall, I just mentioned that the increase in the consumption, in the construction activity, increase in manufacturing activity, and also reduction in the fear of the pandemic was the one that really brought back demand for these contact sensitive sectors. Again, though, while these are all the fundamentals that we must keep in mind, we have assessed the impact of the second wave, and we will remain ready if there is actually, we see that some of these effects that we are anticipating are not manifesting, to definitely respond.
But one of the biggest concerns, sir, that is of the rise in urban unemployment. How do we make a fit case for sustaining lives and livelihoods?
Yeah, I think here again, the construction sector activity is very important, because as we were discussing, urban poor, especially a lot of the migrant labor, works in the construction sites. If you recall the way we were discussing for the third and fourth quarter numbers, increase in construction sector activity did have an impact on the on unemployment numbers as well. The PLFS data, some of it showed. So I think the emphasis on on bringing back some of those activity, and what has been planned for in the budget, front loading some of that expenditure, starting maybe mid-June or so, will really help in this process. You have to keep in mind here that, unlike, for instance, the rural areas where Manrega actually can provide work, and that's because the residents can actually be tracked very well using the Aadhaar number, etc. The migrant labor, it's not as easy to do so, and therefore being able to come up with a targeted program becomes difficult. Of course, there is now work in being able to generate some of this database, but till we don't have that, coming up with an effective program like Manrega for the urban areas actually does pose important challenges. Therefore, we have to actually rely on economic activity, especially those that create jobs in the informal sector, like construction, real estate, many of those, to really provide employment in the urban areas for the urban poor.
All right, I'll just touch upon construction and infrastructure in just a bit. But before that, how much of a worry is the global inflation situation as well as the domestic prices, sir?
So global inflation, I would say is in some sense, at least for the advanced economies, it is sort of a mean reverting phenomenon to some extent, because they've had a period of very low inflation for, before the COVID pandemic, and also in the first year of the COVID pandemic, they had, very, very low inflation. So some of that inflation coming, it does help their nominal growth. And so in that sense, global demand, at least in nominal terms, will be something that will also help on the export side. Now, when it comes to emerging economies possibly face inflation from supply side frictions. These supply side frictions are far greater in emerging economies than in advanced countries. And here's where India has actually been quite judicious in focusing on the supply side, and anticipating that if the supply side aspects are not taken care of, then we may have had a much higher problem of inflation. If you noticed when I made the presentation on Monday after the GDP numbers as well, we saw that for about 9 or 10 months, the CPI inflation was above the 6% band, and that was because of the supply side, disruptions that were created by the pandemic and the lockdown itself. So I think for a country like India, us having focused on removing many of these supply side frictions, especially on the agriculture side, for instance, will hold us in good stead in being able to keep inflation, range bound. If you look at the overall composition of inflation itself, and especially over the last year, food inflation was a big contributor, and now food inflation seems to have moderated. But I would continue watching it because I would be particularly, watching for the impact of the month of May. The restrictions that have been imposed, whether they would have impact on food inflation is something that you keep watching. But apart from that, I think overall I do expect the inflation to be actually range bound. Some people are looking at the WPI inflation being very high. I would like to comment, in that context that first, the WPI inflation is coming off a very low base last year. And secondly, WPI, there was a problem in collection of data last year because of the lockdown. And so, the base last year is also impacted by information being patchy. And so I would therefore focus more on the CPI inflation numbers, for the next few months than the WPI inflation, because, I think the WPI inflation numbers are far more noisy.
All right, so you talked about construction and infrastructure. Now, a very interesting paradox here. The government says that it will have a multiplier effect, large-scale infrastructure projects. But there is a certain section that says it's a huge opportunity cost that we are paying given our health infrastructure at the current juncture. How do you allay those concerns?
Kriti, if you recall, in the economic survey this year, we had written a chapter on healthcare, and we had titled it "Healthcare takes center stage finally." I had also, in my presentation on the economic survey, given this parallel of the movie Three Idiots, where Raju and Farhan go to have dinner. Virus and Farhan go to have dinner at Raju's house, and Raju's mother talks about the out-of-pocket expenditures. I think what has been shown in that movie has actually has been depressingly played out for a lot of families, during the second wave. I think that does again put the onus on us. Really undoing some of the huge lag that has been created over the last 70 years in terms of the health infrastructure. For instance, if you look at some facts, for every 1 lakh people, the US has 34 beds. Yes. For every 1 lakh people, Germany has 29 beds. India, for such a large population, for every 1 lakh people, we have only 2.3 beds. In other words, an order of magnitude different. So not only that, in terms of the per capita number of doctors and nurses that we have, paramedics, these are all aspects that we really need to focus on. I think the aspects that we have highlighted in that economic survey chapter, especially the government spending on healthcare, for it to increase significantly, I think is a very important point of impetus. What we had shown, there was a chart there where we show the non-linear impact of the increase in government spending on private spending by households. So if we increase from the current levels to even close to 2.5% to 3%, then the out-of-pocket spending of households can come down significantly. And I think that is something that all states must do as well. I think if you take the right lesson from this pandemic and all states focus on expanding their health infrastructure significantly, built many more medical schools. For instance, if you look at over the last 7 years, we've had several IITs and IIMs actually being opened. AIMS have been opened as well, but we need far more medical, colleges to be built in the country, so that doctors, far more number of doctors are created. So if our states, and I'm emphasizing states because health is finally a state subject, if our states really take the lesson and, and build the health infrastructure, then, the lives that have been lost during the second wave would not be, at least there will be some saving grace. We would actually have given peace to those souls that actually, have lost their lives during the second wave. I think it's both on humanitarian grounds, on economic grounds, and also on moral grounds. I think it just behooves us now to really invest in health infrastructure and, and ramp it up significantly, especially on the beds and on the soft infrastructure of doctors, nurses, etc.
That's a very important point that you're making. But before we sign off, if we were to brave the third wave, what is your take on the resilience of Indian economy?
So I would emphasize the key role of the vaccination program. As I have mentioned, if we are able to achieve this ambitious but definitely possible goal of vaccinating 70 crore individuals with at least one dose by September, I think that the third wave will not be a very large one. The impact of that on the economy will not be that large. In fact, if vaccination proceeds, and we're able to achieve that target by September, the demand during the festive season can come back significantly. A lot of the pent-up demand, similarly travel, tourism, all of that can come back. And now, the fact that we are working on getting the supplies of vaccines, I think that seems to be the priority. We need to simultaneously also work on ensuring that the other constraints of possible vaccine hesitancy, if there are any, of ensuring that that we have the adequate number of people to vaccinate, to give 1 crore doses a day. That has to be our target, and being able to reach the remote areas. And in reaching for the remote areas, I will use this Hindi saying. Many times it's said that प्यासे को कुएं के पास जाना पड़ता है, but यहाँ पे कुएं को प्यासे के पास जाना पड़ेगा. And we have to do that. Actually, the well has to go to the thirsty here, and in the case of vaccination. If we are able to do that, and I see no reason why we cannot do it, by September, we should definitely be able to actually reduce the impact of the third wave, and thereby also, keep the economy from getting impacted significantly as well.
All right, so we are witnessing the toughest time. We are witnessing one of the biggest economic disruptions in our lifetimes, and that certainly makes your job very, very tough and very, very challenging. But all the best for your endeavors, sir, and thank you so much for speaking to us.